All right, now we're going to move on and discuss the actual application of forensic psychology rather than just the academic and scientific basis of forensic psychology. But before I do, I want to give you a framework of how I am involved as a forensic psychology in the court system based on the structure of the court system in the United States. This will be important to know as we go further in the other lessons where I'm talking about specific laws and statutes. Now, in the United States, we have federal laws and state laws. We also have federal courts and state courts. Federal laws are national laws. State laws differ among the different states and are written, written differently in different states. Now, if you commit a crime in the United States and you cross state lines, so for example, if you are transporting drugs to a different state for sale, that would be considered a federal crime because you crossed state lines. If you took a minor, for example, across state lines with the intent to have sex with that minor, that would be a federal crime. Also, if you rob a bank in the United States, that's considered a federal crime. Or if you do a crime on federal lands, that's considered a federal crime. State crimes are basically other crimes that are committed within the state. So, for example, if you stole someone's car, that would be a state crime. If you robbed a store or broke into someone's house, that would be a state crime. Now, if you're wondering, what if someone violates both laws, a federal law and a state law? Federal law can overtake state law. So, for example, if you break a law that violates federal law and state law, the federal government, the federal law enforcement can decide if they want to prosecute you or not. Sometimes they will pick up the case. Sometimes they'll say to the state, we really aren't interested in that case, and then the state can prosecute you. There are also times where federal law and state law conflict. So, for example, the most pertinent example now in the United States is drug law. So federal law says it is illegal to possess or use marijuana. However, recently there have been several states in the U.S. that have passed laws legalizing marijuana. At this point, the federal government has just decided to not prosecute those cases. But any time they could pick those cases up and prosecute them if they chose to. Now you see in slide 7, I put a structure of the American court system. It's important to understand as a forensic psychologist the court system structure, and if you're a forensic psychologist in the UK or Australia, it's important to understand the court structure as well. So for references of our discussion in the United States court system, we already talked about federal laws and state laws, and you see under each it's criminal and civil. Criminal is self-explanatory. Civil would be things like if you're filing a lawsuit or suing someone, or if you have a business issue like a disagreement over a contract. Now, whether it becomes state civil or federal civil kind of depends on what the issue is. So, for example, if you were going to sue someone because they did bad work on your house, that would likely fall under the state courts. If you were going to sue someone because they discriminated against you for a job, that would be a federal civil lawsuit. Family courts you see down here. Family courts in the United States typically address two issues. Number one, divorce and custody of children. So family courts will make decisions in regards to where the children are going to live or what parent they're going to live with most of the time. The other thing that falls under family courts is neglect and abuse. If someone is accused of abusing their child or neglecting their child, that'll be handled through a family court. Probate courts. Probate courts handle things like wills and estate, but where a forensic psychologist works a lot in probate court is guardianship. So for example, I might do a forensic exam of a person in order to inform the probate court whether or not this person needs a legal guardian, whether or not they cannot manage their own affairs. Applications of forensic psychology. So a person who's a forensic psychologist a lot of times has a lot of training in law and in psychology. So for example, I was fortunate enough to go through the training program at the Federal Bureau of Prisons for a year.
I was in Lexington, Kentucky. And we had to read all kinds of case law and have all kinds of legal training. And we had our psychology training already. And then we had to go into court. We had to work with, we had a retired federal judge who used to come in, and we would practice cross-examination with him. So we had to go through a whole legal training program. There are some folks who do forensic work that have gained the legal training after they became sort of the general regular psychologist. So that's something you can do as well. So the idea is that as a forensic psychologist, if you're competent, you've been trained in both law and psychology. So some of the things that a forensic psychologist would do: become involved in criminal proceedings, do a pretrial evaluation. And we're going to expand on these in a minute, but if I have to evaluate someone before the trial and give an opinion about their competency to stand trial, that's going to be a pretrial. In trial, that can be consultation, sentencing. As a forensic examiner, I might do an evaluation for the federal courts about departure of sentencing. So sometimes the forensic psychologist will get involved in a case at the sentencing phase. So for example, a risk offender, or a sex offender risk assessment. In Canada, if you want, if you get convicted of a sex offense, before you are sentenced, you have a comprehensive forensic risk assessment by a forensic psychologist. The Canadians are miles ahead of this kind of stuff as compared to the States. So why do they do that? Well, the Canadian Solicitor General said, we're going to do this because we want to make best use of Canadian taxpayer dollars. So let me give you a real world example. Flashers, you know who these guys are? Who expose themselves, right? It used to be the big raincoat, right? Flashers are actually pretty easy to treat psychologically. But, so for example, in Michigan, you might see a flasher who gets prosecuted under the Sexually Delinquent Act, which is a law, and they've been convicted of flashing before and didn't get any treatment. After the third time, they could do life in prison. Now, is that a good way at, what's it cost now, $60,000 a year to keep someone in prison? 37? Is it? Okay. That's a lot of money, isn't it? Yeah. And there's like 50,000 inmates. But anyway, so in Canada, what they would do, typically, or stereotypically, is they'd get the flasher in, and for sentencing, they'd say, you know what? It's better use of Canadian taxpayers' dollars to put this person in the community, have intensive probation, and have them see a psychologist to treat their problem. Where the other side could be, if someone is a pedophile who has an appetite towards children that are under 5 years old, we know based on the research that that person is probably going to be high likely to offend. So, for example, in the Canadian system, they would probably say he's a high risk to reoffend, and they would imprison him much longer. All right? So, in Canada, in my opinion, they do the right thing, and what they do is they focus on the science behind their decision. In the U.S., we focus a lot on the politics behind the decisions a lot of times, right? Okay. Family court. I already talked about that. Family court would be divorces, mostly. So if people are fighting over custody, mom says dad's crazy, dad says mom's crazy. Judge says, Jeff, figure it out. Most of the time the people aren't crazy, but they're going through a bad time and they're maybe not acting the right way. So a lot of times they'll do these evaluations and I'll say, mom's okay, she doesn't have any mental illness, she's a good parent. Dad's okay, he doesn't have any mental illness, he's a good parent. They're not dealing with the situation well. And then the judge will say, you two sort of need to knock it off and quit bringing up these questions. You both have the necessary psychological capacity to parent. And probate court would be things like guardianship. So if you have a mental illness or if you have dementia and someone wants to get guardianship over you, you would go to probate court. And civil litigation, which I accidentally skipped, has a lot to do with suing. So if you want to sue someone for emotional damages, you might go see a forensic psychologist to get your evaluation. So often your task as a forensic psychologist is applying psychological science to the legal statute or principle. So a good forensic psychologist knows the science, the psychological science behind sex offender risk variables and sex offender risk assessment. And the good and well-trained forensic psychologist does an evaluation of the person, and does the evaluation within the context of what the science says about what the risk for that person would be. And then the good, well-trained forensic psychologist goes into court and testifies and educates the court about this person's risk. And then the court, the model would go, can make an informed decision about what to do in sentencing, for example. All right? So that's why it's important to have good training in the law, because what you're going to find here in a minute is, as a forensic psychologist, I have to read the law and find out what the law says about this particular issue that I have to weigh an opinion on.